Good afternoon, and thank you all for coming. This is a wonderful turnout, and it's only befitting because there's going to be a wonderful discussion, a talk by Matt Richtel, who will introduce to you in just a couple of minutes, and hopefully time for you to ask some questions of Matt at the end of his talk. My name is Steve Terrett. I'm a professor, associate dean in the school, and I long time ago former director of the Center for Injury Research and Policy, and it's a great pleasure to be able to talk with you at this annual lecture that we have. I'd like to first introduce Professor Sue Baker. When it comes to automotive safety and automotive safety policy, I think that Sue has the first patent on that. Sue is a person who has taught all of us about how to deal with reducing the toll that driving takes on the population. Sue, if you wouldn't mind coming up, please.
Thank you, Steve. The National Transportation Safety Board, known to many of us as NTSB, is charged with investigating and trying to prevent tragedies on our highways, airways, waterways, even pipelines. One of its excellent investigators by the name of Daniel Raskin was killed some 20 years ago when he was working as a volunteer firefighter. And the equipment that a hose coupling, exploded, and he died very shortly thereafter of the injuries. His family has called attention to not only him and his work, because he was a tireless safety advocate, but to the work that is done by our center and by the school here in terms of injury prevention by helping us to establish a memorial in the Daniel Raskin Memorial Lecture. And this is something that we will understand better when we hear from our next speaker, Bruce McGladrey. Bruce is Director of Highway Safety for the National Transportation Safety Board and was a good friend of Danny Raskin's. Bruce, if you'd tell us a little bit about him.
Good afternoon. I'm glad that you invited me here today to say a few words about the person for which this lecture is dedicated, Danny Raskin. As been mentioned, Danny was a friend of mine and a co-worker at the National Transportation Safety Board, where I met him more than 20 years ago. He was a young man when I arrived, but already an accomplished accident investigator. He used his background in psychology as a springboard to looking at behavior of vehicle operators that have precipitated accidents, an area that we tend to call human factors today. He was interested in not only what happened in an accident, but why it happened, so the future events could be prevented. As you all know, it's a serious and sober responsibility to prevent accidents and save lives. Danny took this to heart, both in his day job as an NTSB investigator, but also his part-time employment as a volunteer fireman. As has been mentioned, Danny was enthusiastic, dedicated, worked hard at both the things that he did. He had many things that were great in his past, and he had many things of promise in his future. Unfortunately, as Sue mentioned, Danny died in an accident while fighting a fire when he was only 31 years old. And so as a result of that, many of the promises of Danny's life were not met. However, some continue, and this lecture is one of those. Danny would be excited about a talk here today. He'd be fascinated with our speaker and the speaker's topic. He'd be sitting in the front row, he'd be leaning forward so he wouldn't miss anything that was said. I will do the same. thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Bruce. So now in honor of Danny Raskin and also on behalf of the entire School of Public Health and our Dean Michael Clagg, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for the day, Mr. Matt Richtel. Matt is a journalist. He works for the New York Times, and one of the things for which he's known, but it's not the only thing for which he's known, because I should mention that he's also a novelist. He's published one novel already that's been out for a couple of years that's entitled Hook, but he has another novel that's going to be coming out, I think it's in May 2011, that's called The Devil's Plaything. But we're introducing him today principally as the New York Times reporter who wrote a series of articles on the topic of distracted driving, a topic that is of great importance in the United States and elsewhere in the world today. The epidemiology of these injuries is only becoming known, and the proper kinds of policies that need to be crafted that will be effective in addressing these kinds of injuries is still, I think, in the developmental stage. For the work that Matt did in writing the series of articles on distracted driving, he won the Pulitzer Prize, a prize coveted by any and every journalist. Matt lives in San Francisco. We're especially fortunate to have him come out here because in addition to living with his wife and 2-year-old child, he lives with his 6-week-old, 9 weeks tomorrow, child, so he needs to get back soon to help with the diapers. So we're especially pleased that Matt was able to take time out of his schedule to come talk with us today. Matt?
With regard to the kids, if any of you knows my wife or speaks to her, do not let on that I had an uninterrupted night of sleep last night. Keep it between us. I want to thank the school, and I also want to say to any Raskin family members and friends who are here. The other day, we were out for a Halloween festival, and my son, who's 2, was dressed as a firefighter. And then his best friend was dressed as a firefighter, and then their other best friend was dressed as a firefighter. And I looked out across a sea of 2-year-old boys. They were all firefighters. So I'd been thinking about how to express my condolences about his loss, and I guess what I can say is even the 2-year-olds know what heroes these guys are. And so when you look out at Halloween, know they're carrying his memory. And now, naturally, a word about Martha Stewart. Steve mentioned the book that came out a few years ago. It was called Hooked. It was a mystery. It was my first book. And I had a friend go to Barnes & Noble to pick it up, and he found it there on the front table. And it was sandwiched between a Superman anthology and a book by Martha Stewart. So he pulls out his phone to take a picture of it, and a person comes from behind the counter and says, "Excuse me, sir, what are you doing?" And my friend says, "Oh, I'm taking a picture of my friend's book." And the guy says, "Oh my gosh, you're friends with Martha Stewart?" So, look, I'm a journalistic foot soldier, and I usually toil in anonymity, a guy with a pen and a not very recognized byline. And so it's a great honor for you guys to have me here today to talk about a subject we spent about a year covering, and to have us discuss our work, because today you have made me feel a bit more like Martha Stewart. So, from comedy, or let's say very, very mild comedy, to tragedy, How's that for a segue? It's downhill from here. I'm going to tell you about a murder mystery. It's the story of the death of two rocket scientists by the names of Keith Odell and Jim Ferraro. They were senior scientists at ATK Systems in northern Utah, where they helped design rocket boosters for the next space shuttle. Keith was 50, and he was such a brainiac that his nickname was the Genius. And Jim was 38, and he was kind of a goofball, and just prior to his death, he'd actually undertaken the hobby of unicycling. Both were family men, wives and kids. They were commuting to work on September 22nd, 2006, in Logan, Utah, which is a Verdant Valley in the northernmost county of the state. And also driving to work that morning was Reggie Shaw, age 20, soft-spoken and deferential. He attended a Mormon college where he played basketball. He actually interrupted his studies to go on a mission, but he felt duty-bound to admit to the mission director that he'd had sex in the months before going on his mission and was asked to leave the mission because that was a deal breaker. It sort of underscores what an honest fellow he is. Not long after he came home from his mission on the morning of September 22, which I mentioned, Reggie was driving to work for a painting job in his Chevrolet Tahoe. It was drizzling. It was just after 7 a.m., and Reggie crossed the yellow divider, and he clipped the Saturn carrying the two rocket scientists. It spun across the highway and he was hit by a truck carrying 2 tons of horseshoes and horseshoe-making equipment. And forgive this image because I know you're eating, but I think it's pertinent to this conversation. The scientists died on impact. The collision so intense that it popped out both of Keith's eyeballs. In the aftermath, Reggie couldn't remember what had distracted him. He was unhurt but traumatized. And in the months-long investigation that followed, phone records showed exactly what distracted him. Reggie and his girlfriend had texted 11 times in the minutes and seconds before the crash. As the evidence unfolded, Reggie was well into his second Mormon mission. He was called into the director's office and told he was being sent home again. This time, he was charged with negligent homicide. Reggie eventually took a plea deal that entailed 30 days in jail, 200 hours of community service, and a requirement that he read Les Miserables because the judge wanted him to understand how, like Jean Valjean, Les Miserables' main character, to contribute to society. And so as part of his efforts, he found himself in 2008 speaking before the state Utah legislature, which was considering a tough ban on texting while driving. The legislation seemed destined to fail. In fact, legislators during the testimony were not only talking to each other, some were seen texting. And then Reggie got up to testify, and he began sobbing. You know those scientists you heard about? Mr. Shaw began speaking through tears. I'm the one who killed them. The nation's toughest law passed. Under Utah's law, someone caught texting and driving faces up to 3 months in jail and a $750 fine, a misdemeanor. But if injury or death results, it can raise to a felony and up to a $10,000 fine and 15 years in prison, which is the equivalent of the penalties for drinking and driving and killing someone. So, end of story, right? Open and shut case of DWT, driving while texting and talking. Not so fast. Let me tell you why I'm here today. I'm here not to rehash a harrowing case that makes stark the stakes involved in the distracted driving conversation. I'm here to put Reggie Shaw and his story into a larger context, one that I hope will shed light on the scope of the challenges and influence involved here, and to shed some light on how we came to attack this issue at the New York Times and why, and perhaps why it resonated. So let me backtrack. When I started looking into the issue of distracted driving 2 years ago, it was a subject I knew next to nothing about, other than sometimes being awestruck by my own silly behavior. I think the thing that struck me the most is I'd be behind the wheel, and I would actually call someone I had really little desire to talk to just to be entertained. There was a compulsive aspect to the behavior I couldn't understand, and with all due apologies, if you're one of those people I called, I absolutely wanted to talk to you. So my research began with an editor asking what we call a good dumb question. Here was the question. What does it mean that we're turning the front and driver's seats of our car into digital hubs with phones and smartphones and computers and GPS systems that allow us to build a PowerPoint presentation while we're changing lanes? And what do I mean that this was a dumb question? I mean it in the best possible way. The editor that I work with has an adage that says, the best stories come from good dumb questions, meaning questions that are obvious, but sometimes journalists feel too sophisticated to ask. Maybe we suffer a little expertitis, or maybe we just don't want to look at what's right under our nose. And so for the next 4 months, I literally looked right at what was under my nose with the basic step of typing into Google distracted driving. I came across the name of David Strayer. He's a psychology professor and neuroscientist at the University of Utah. I learned that he runs a high-tech driving simulator at the university, and I learned that for more than 5 years, he'd been using the simulator to test how distractions affect drivers. I learned the breadth of research that he and others had discovered. And let me just go down a list of some of that prevailing research that had been around for quite some time. A driver talking on the phone behind the wheel faces a 4 times greater crash risk than if not on the phone. I learned that that was the equivalent in his laboratory studies of someone with a 0.08 blood alcohol content, which in most states is the legal limit for intoxication. I learned that he and other researchers found that the risk of texting behind the wheel was even greater. He found it to be 8 times greater crash risk than not texting, and others, such as at the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, found it to be a 23 times greater crash risk than not texting. In fact, lots of researchers corroborated Dr. Strayer's findings. For instance, 2 studies of actual crashes, epidemiological data, one in Canada and one in Australia, found that drivers on cell phones faced a 4-fold increased crash risk. I learned that drivers using a headset that enables them to keep both hands on the wheel do not eliminate the risk. Or rather, I should be more precise, since this is a topic still being debated by some scientists. The epidemiological data in the lab studies showed a 4 times greater crash risk even when someone used a headset, whereas the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute, aforementioned, found that using a headset did eliminate some of the risks. And those are naturalistic studies that put a camera in a car. So being true to my journalistic ethos, I'm going to tell you this is a subject still ongoing for debate. But I'll tell you, the epidemiologists and the lab researchers came down to this basic tenet. If you're on a call and you face a harrowing situation behind the wheel, say someone skirts in front of you, a child runs in the road, because your brain is otherwise occupied on the phone, you lack the full brain processing power to react. And researchers have known for a long time, since they were doing research into how military pilots fly back in World War II and World War I, that the brain can really only process one stream of information at a time. It doesn't switch. I mean, it doesn't dually process. It switches between the tasks. So, I also learned in this spirit the answer to perhaps the question I get more than any other, often asked me as a gotcha question like, well, Mr. Journalist, let's hear the answer to this one. And that question is this: what if I have a passenger in the seat with me, next to me? Does that create the same kind of risk as talking on the phone? Remarkably enough, what the research showed, it was remarkable to me when I first asked it, is that the passenger actually provides safety enhancement. And I guess you can imagine why. It's because the passenger acts as a second set of eyes on the road, either modulating his or her conversation or actually saying, hey, look at the road. It's icy. So I learned some fascinating statistics. I learned that the Harvard Center for Risk Analysis estimated in 2003 that 2,600 people die a year from accidents caused by distracted drivers using phones, and that such distracted drivers cause 330,000 injury accidents a year, serious injury accidents. But I also learned that there's a hole in the research. We don't know the actual number of accidents or deaths because police only recently began collecting the data, and where they collect the data, oftentimes people don't tell the truth. And sometimes, I think this is rarer, as in the case of Reggie Shaw, they are so traumatized that they don't remember what happened. And I will testify to you that I believe Reggie Shaw when he says he didn't remember what happened in the minutes before the crash. And here's another statistical question that came up. We've actually seen a fall in the number of highway deaths and a fall in the number of accidents on the roads in recent years. And so folks like in the cell phone industry, for example, would say to me, well, Matt, you need to make note of the fact that we've had all these devices in the car and we've seen an overall fall in the number of deaths on the roadways. How can this be explained? Here's what safety advocates and researchers would say to me. They would say, well, sure, governments have spent billions on roadway safety and cars have gotten so much safer with airbags and the technology behind anti-lock brakes. And they say, the safety advocates would say, we'd be seeing much bigger dividends if people weren't behind the wheel multitasking while they drive. So I went to Dr. Strayer's lab to check out his driving simulator, and I watched a 19-year-old student, a subject in the simulator, try to drive and talk on the phone at the same time and send texts and answer her phone. And very quickly, she crashed this virtual car that she was trying to drive into the virtual car and the screen in front of her. And I asked her about it. I said, is this alarming to you? Tell me how you feel. And she said, and I quote, my dad gets more mad if I don't have the phone than if I'm talking while driving. This anecdote was pivotal for me in my understanding of this topic and for us, and it underscored another statistical reality and a key one. People told pollsters over and over again they feel talking on the phone and driving is risky. Multitasking behind the wheel is a risk. And yet over and over again, they are doing more and more of it. It was as if they were saying, yes, this is a problem, but it's everyone else's problem. Don't bug me, I'm dialing. And this simple idea became a cornerstone of our series, the idea, in a word, disconnect. People sense there's a risk, even without knowing the data, and yet they continue to compute behind the wheel. But why? Why this disconnect? As I was visiting with Strayer, he mentioned that he'd worked for Verizon in his first job out of college. He was in their research lab, and he said, do you think we ought to study the impact of having cars having cars and phones? Yes, of course it made no sense. So naturally they wouldn't look into it. The phones were so small. How would you get the car inside? He wanted to look into the question of what would happen if you had people talking on the phone behind the wheel, and Verizon said to him, I don't think we need to look into it. He also mentioned to me that, like the phone industry, the government had been aware for years of the problem of multitasking behind the wheel and had ignored it. In fact, Strayer and a handful of well-regarded researchers I talked to were saying that the research had been out there for years and government and industry had assiduously and even deliberately ignored it. What I learned was that they were right. People did know. Powerful people, some of the nation's most powerful, and they did ignore it. And the way the proof unfolded for us and for me, was a series of journalistic shivers. The kinds of revelations you imagine you might find when you're a young journalist and then realize you're often covering the school board meeting and the revelations are not that stark and just mostly a series of personal barbs. So I tried to find out what the government knew. I came across some researchers who worked in around 2001 and 2002 for the National Highway Transportation Safety Association, NHTSA. They told me how they'd done a meta-study, a study of all the research that was out there, and they found hundreds of papers, remember this is 2001 and 2, showing the risks associated with multitasking behind the wheel. In fact, they'd recommended to NHTSA, the head of NHTSA, that he urge all of the state governors to discourage the use of mobile devices by drivers, and they even wrote up a draft letter of the recommendation, all wrapped up and ready for the head of NHTSA to give to the then head of Department of Transportation, Norm Mineta. And among their talking points was the following sentence. We therefore recommend that the drivers not use wireless communications devices, including text messaging systems underlined, when driving except in an emergency. The year was 2003. The letter was never sent, the talking points not made public, the meta-study was not published, or rather, all that was published was a list of articles, but no summary, as the researchers had included, of the gravity of the findings. All the research was essentially reduced to a list of links, eminently ignorable and widely ignored. The researchers claimed it had been stymied for political reasons, but had it been? Was there another explanation? As you might imagine, the bar in most journalistic institutions, certainly at the New York Times, is high for printing such an allegation as this. And so how would I get to the bottom of it? Well, my aim was to start at the top. At the time the information was allegedly suppressed, the head of NHTSA was Dr. Jeff Runge. He was a well-regarded safety advocate. The head of a well-regarded safety advocate, and I did the gumshoe reporting you do as a journalist. I looked for email addresses, I did searches on the internet, I looked for friends of friends. I finally found a phone number that I believed to be his house in Virginia, and a gentleman answered and said that Dr. Runge was on vacation in Europe and asked who I was, and I told him. I said why I was calling and who I was, and I didn't know if I'd ever hear back. After all, if you're Dr. Runge and maybe you're worried about this, or it troubles you, or you don't want to talk about it, this is probably not the first call you return when you get back from your relaxing vacation in Europe. Well, I remember just where I was when the call came in. Excuse me. End of speech. I remember just where I was when the call came in. I'm based in San Francisco, but I'd gone to New York for a periodic visit to the home office. My cell phone rings. I don't recognize the number. I pick up, and I hear, "This is Jeff Runge." I said, "Hello, Dr. Runge. Nice of you to call me back." And I'm literally scrambling to a cubicle to find a pen and a reporter's notebook. And just as I can get my hand starting to write, he lays it all out. Here's what he says. He says that indeed he'd withheld the data, and very grudgingly. He told me he'd been urged to do so by officials at the Department of Transportation, which oversees NHTSA, on the grounds that Congress had warned NHTSA to focus on safety issues, not to lobby individual states. He was told that hundreds of millions of dollars of funding to the Department of Transportation could be at stake. Now, I needed to corroborate this, and I did, to an extent. One of the transportation officials who had been in the room, a very high-level person, an aide to Norm Mineta, had a slightly different version of the story, but largely corroborated it. He said that NHTSA's research had been sufficiently inconclusive that more work needed to be done. Well, it was pretty big stuff, even as such, but it was not an isolated revelation. The government was not alone in having some basic awareness of what was going on and in failing to let the rest of us know about it. The next question I asked was, what did the cell phone industry know about the risks, and what did they do about the information? It was another, if you will, smart, dumb question. In a nutshell, the question was, didn't the industry used to call the cell phone a car phone? Shouldn't they have known about the risks? I'm actually itching. I'm not doing shouldn't they have known about the risks? This, too, led to several intense reporting shivers. I'll spare you the forensics of the reporting, but here are a few highlights, or if you prefer, the lowlights. I was on the phone with Martin Cooper. You may not know his name, but you know his work. He designed the first cell phone at Motorola. He tells me a story about how a Michigan State Safety Committee asked him to testify about the safety of using phones behind the wheel. He told them that doing so could cause driver distraction and recommended that they put locks on the dialing mechanism. The year was 1963. He was referring to the early radio phones. Remember I mentioned the estimates that 2,600 people die each year talking on phones in the car? Well, guess who funded the original study? It was AT&T. The industry itself gave the money. It couldn't claim not to know about the problems, and that year, to reiterate, was 2002. Other industry pioneers corroborated the story. They had known about or suspected the risks of using devices while driving, but had every reason to look the other way. Why? Well, this part is fairly obvious. Dumber than a smart, dumb question, because there was money to be made. Yes, the wireless industry indeed built itself as a car phone. In fact, an analyst, a financial analyst from the time who was well regarded, told me that well into the 90s, wireless companies got 75% of their revenue from drivers. The wireless companies bragged about how much coverage they had on highways. Their ads promoted the car phone unabashedly. I'll tell you one ad for Centel, which ultimately merged with Sprint, shows this handsome man driving on a road in his Jeep on the car phone, talking on it. And then they flash to his beautiful wife, who is on a boat, standing up, driving in the middle of the lake, talking on her phone. So they created a kind of idyllic picture of what it was like to communicate while you were behind the wheel. In short, the industry was making money off car phones while knowingly questioning or dismissing a growing body of research about the risk. And I want to mention one more curious disconnect, before I tell you about what any of this has to do with Reggie Shaw. I stumbled upon this other disconnect when I was in a place called Joplin, Missouri. Last year I'd gone there to report about one angle of the distracted driving story that I won't elaborate on here, and I was on California time, and I'd landed in the early evening and wasn't ready to go to sleep, and so I started driving around, and I saw a massive truck stop. And it turns out to be not merely massive to the layperson, but genuinely massive because Joplin, Missouri sits in a place that's a hub of 4 states. And I got off, I started walking around, and I walked inside this truck stop, and I started wondering, well, I wonder what truckers do behind the wheel. Got myself a grilled cheese sandwich, that's true, and started talking to truckers. And over the next few days, I came across a number of truckers who use their devices behind the wheel. In fact, in the store there at the truck stop, on prominent display was a device you use the laptop in your lap while you're trucking. But I want to tell you about Kurt Long. He is one of the gentlemen I met. He's a mountain-sized long-haul trucker, or he was, and he was very frank about his penchant for multitasking behind the wheel. He took me into his cab. He showed me the keyboard that he used in his lap to communicate with dispatch and to check his email and the little screen on which he did it. He told me, look, we pay lip service in this industry to the idea that you shouldn't use your device while behind the wheel, but not only is it lip service, we're actually discouraged from pulling over to communicate with dispatch because the premium in our industry is put on getting from one place to the other as quickly as possible. And he said the demerits you get from being late on a delivery are far harsher than you would get for communicating with dispatch while driving. And in fact, the dispatchers would know that because they can tell when you're moving and communicating. I had a photographer along with me, and we got a powerful shot of Kurt Long with his dog sitting in his lap, who drives with him, and his keyboard that wound up accompanying a story about the trucking industry. And here's its position. It told us, look, we can do this. Our drivers are professional. They only look at their screens for a few seconds. This is in the name of efficiency. And so here was another kind of disconnect, a disconnect that said, we can handle this at the professional level, even though the research would show from Virginia Tech and other places that when you take your eyes off the wheel for 2 seconds or more, your crash risk goes up. So I guess this is a reasonably good segue, or reasonably poor segue, which is, what does this have to do with Reggie Shaw? Pointedly, the government knew, and the industry knew, and the trucking industry, one of the nation's most powerful, knew, but Reggie Shaw did not know. at least not explicitly. No one told him in driver's education. No one told him in school. In fact, most of the messages he was receiving were encouraging his behavior. Industry marketing messages urged him to be constantly connected and suggested that being unplugged any time was uncool. Social pressures reinforced it. Professional truckers, at least indirectly, were multitasking at high speeds and in some cases lobbying against regulations that would restrict texting behind the wheel. And there's one more pressure I want to mention that was working against Reggie Shaw, the neurologic pressure, the neurological pressure not to disconnect. It turns out that there are lots of reasons, psychological and even physiological, that make it hard for us to put down our devices. This is the subject of a series we're working on this year called Your Brain on Computers. But in brief, what the researchers say is that when you get a ping on your device, you get a little dopamine squirt. You get a little burst of adrenaline that is a communication with your pleasure centers. And if you're anything like me, you know exactly what this feels like. You go, oh, that could be good. And that also dovetails with the psychological pressures that are involved here. And those I will illustrate by way of a bit of a crass analogy. You know the research, probably from your psychology texts, you put a rat in a cage and put a food dispenser there, but you put food down the dispenser only periodically. The rat is incented to check all the time. It's called intermittent reinforcement. It's among the most powerful lures in psychology, and if you'll forgive the analogy, it might be a little bit what it's like when we hear the ping of our device, and even when we don't hear it, we're incented to check all the time because we never know when it's going to be the good email or the good text. Most of the time it might not be, but occasionally it is. That's our food pellet. So I want to be clear here. I'm not trying to exonerate Reggie. In fact, he would hate that. He has become a true voice in this conversation about what to do behind the wheel. What I'm trying to do is put what happened to him into this larger context and to explain the pressure that we all feel to stay connected. Now, in the last year, there have been some real effort that has emerged to combat these other messages. There was a distracted driving summit held last year and again this year, put on by the Department of Transportation. The federal government banned employees from texting while driving on work time. Webster's New World Dictionary last year actually called distracted driving its word of the year. I guess only a dictionary can make 2 words into its word of the year. Put the car into the phone. Oprah, arguably the most influential person in the known galaxy, labeled the car a no-phone zone, and a growing number of states have passed texting bans. I find one stat particularly compelling in explaining the spate of activity and perhaps in explaining why our stories resonated. It's a remarkable one to me. In the last 5 years, 30% of people say the roads have gotten less safe, according to a survey by the AAA Foundation for Traffic Safety. I should note that that number's actually gone up from 30%, and I don't have it in front of me, but that number's gone up from 30% according to a more recent study. But just think about that stat, whether it's 30% or more. Even as we have spent billions on roadway safety and added all these safety enhancements to our cars, people feel the roads are less safe than they felt they were 5 years ago. One reason for that, according to the same poll, the fear of rampant multitasking. People want someone to do something to improve safety so long as they don't have to do it themselves. Now, I want to say one more thing about the Pulitzer Prize, or one thing about the Pulitzer Prize and the series of stories. They were really built in a respect on the backs of tragedy. They were built on the backs of people who shared their stories with us, people who lost family members and friends, and people who were behind the wheel and were culpable in an accident. And they came forward and shared their stories with me, and I am thankful to them, everyone who shared their stories. It's hard to be too self-congratulatory when those are the circumstances. what we were doing is try to answer a smart, dumb question, and their answers were invaluable in that. I also want to thank the researchers in the public policy and public health arena from Utah and Virginia and Iowa, and I mean, go down the list. And here at Johns Hopkins, people working on attention were invaluable in helping me understand these issues. So thank you to you as well. We are in some ways communicators of what you guys learn and research and provide. So let me just close with this. I am a journalist and I'm not a policy person, but I think I can say broadly this issue is not going away. Car makers are putting into their cars ever more elaborate digital devices. If they were digital hubs before, they are the more so now, and you can understand why. They're trying to differentiate their products. And the phones are getting smarter, as they call it. They have more things pinging at us, more data that's hard to ignore, and we are social people and have trouble ignoring it. So I think that the pressure to keep us connected is growing, even as we're recognizing more and more the dangers associated with it. So I want to take some questions. I hope I haven't overstayed my welcome, and I also finally want to leave you with an apology, which is this. Given that you made me feel like Martha Stewart for the day, I probably should have brought dessert. I failed in that. If you have me back, I will carve you an ice castle. So let me stop and take some questions. Yes.
First, thank you for a superb talk. And secondly, especially pleased that you mentioned the problem with truck drivers, because one of the school's faculty members was killed some years ago when her car and many others had stopped because of something on the highway, and a tractor-trailer driver who was corresponding on his computer with dispatch went into the back and killed her and her husband. I'd like to ask you if you have any suggestions, particularly with regard to truck drivers and their need to talk with dispatch and so on, any suggestions as to what might alleviate the problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think you phrased that well, because they do need to talk to dispatch. I mean, that's essentially what they do. They need to be rerouted. They need to know where to pick something up. In fairness to the trucking industry, there are real efficiencies that associate to us with real costs in society with getting one load to a place in an efficient manner. They're starting to take some steps by saying, look, we will send you a message that tells you, please pull over. Now we've got a message that's urgent for you to hear. Conceivably, there can be, I want to be careful to stay on the journalistic side of the policy debate, but I know that they have started to put in tougher penalties for truckers texting behind the wheel. There are some conversations about giving them broader access to hands-free devices, but I want to be, I'll stay on the journalistic side of it and say, where you run into a problem is where eyes are off the road for more than 2 seconds. And if you want to see something remarkable, go to the Virginia Tech Transportation Institute website and look at the video they've done in their naturalistic studies of truckers interacting with the screen in front of them and swerving to avoid an accident. It seems clear from the research that that is not an answer. At least what I can glean from the research is you keep your eyes on the road, you keep your hands on the wheel, and depending on who you choose to believe in this debate, you don't correspond at all with someone not in the car, because you're liable to be distracted in times of intense, when your focus is most intensely needed. Yes?
I was wondering if you found any information about GPS machines, because they're currently marketed as something that should actually be
The closest thing I've seen on GPS, and it's actually a great question, has to do with that 2-second number of your eyes being off the wheel. You could apply that to a variety of different media. Where this debate gets interesting, of course, is for years people looked down at their lap on the handwritten directions in their, that people need to find directions or they would get lost or confused. There is an interesting way to think about this conversation that is not tangential to the GPS, but not direct, and that is, it depends to extent the nature of the device you're using insofar as how long you're engaged with the device. Steve showed me earlier that an interesting graph that resonates with the research I've done, which says that over time, two things happen behind the wheel. Your attention level fluctuates, and the roadway problems fluctuate. And at some point, if your attention dips at the moment the bad thing happens, that's where you get an accident. Now, if you look at the GPS on, very occasionally, like you might pick up a hamburger, that could be one circumstance. If you are constantly on your device, that prolongs the time in which you might run into one of those more difficult situations. This is a very lay explanation of that, so please don't take that as, as mimicking research or repeating research, but that's one way to think about it. Yes?
Can you use the microphone so I can hear it?
In terms of the difference between a person talking on a phone and talking to someone next to them, when you were going through your exploration of the research being did you come across some discussion about the fact that when people are by themselves in a car speaking on a phone to somebody who's not there, they actually need to envision that person put them in some context so that in addition to there's like an aural distraction, there's also a virtual visual distraction.
I did come across that, and that's right. There is research, and some of that might be out of here at Johns Hopkins. I can't recall, that suggests you project into your mind's eye something. Now, I've had the questions asked of me though as well on this, and I think it's a fair question that I don't completely have the answer to or understand. It may well be out there, which is I happen to be a sports fan. So now that I no longer talk on the phone while I'm behind the wheel, I listen to a lot of sports radio, and I might be picturing the Giants game that I'm hearing about on the radio, and it's not clear to me what the relative risks are there. I think you raise an absolutely true point, but I think that there are relative risks that need to be understood in that context. There's someone.
How about we start here?
It was easier when there was one hand going up.
Your anecdote about Reggie really highlighted how unaware young or new drivers are. In your research, did you uncover any efforts by groups to change drivers' education for young drivers, or really educating teenagers or people new to the road about these risks?
I haven't looked into the driver education angle a bunch. I think it's beginning, but it actually is one place where I think you're going to see more movement, and that is because it's the one place where industry and all researchers and all public safety advocates seem to agree is that let's focus on the kids. Now, the public safety advocates would say that's insufficient. The car makers and others would say, let's at least agree that let's get the young people better educated. And so a lot of the campaigns that are coming out, the nonprofit campaigns, the public, suddenly the name escapes me, the public service announcements, thank you, have begun to focus on young people. Whether that is translated to driver education, I'm not sure yet. Yes?
This question is, are we being distractions? Early in your speech, you basically said that cognitive distraction is not a multitasking kind of thing. Your attention goes back and forth, right? 4 times as likely to have a crash. That science, right, epidemiologically, brain science, is pretty well established. That's not, right?
Well, it's been interesting to watch Department of Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood continue to push on this subject because I think he feels like unless you keep hammering on this point and hammering on this point, it's very easily forgotten in a world where we really celebrate our devices. I mean, this next story that I'm going to be doing for our Your Brain on Computers series is set at a campus high school campus in Northern California where one young lady texts 27,000 times a month, and she's not that much of an anomaly. And among young people, it is part and parcel of life. So yes, it is. I think there are competing messages going to people. One is there's distraction, and the other is this is the coolest thing. I mean, after all, let's compare it, the messages of this, of multitasking to drunk driving. I mean, there were a lot of people who resisted the idea that they should have to not drive after they had 2 drinks. It was just what people did for a long time. But on a basic level, they also kind of understood that there wasn't really productivity associated with drinking. But a lot of the messages associated with these devices are that they lend us productivity. I mean, who among us hasn't gotten behind the wheel and said, I can get in one more work call that I couldn't otherwise make, or I can call that relative I really owe a call to. And that is both part real and part of a global message that says we want to be productive and on all the time. Those are very powerful messages, distraction versus these other ones that are coming to a head. Just one thing about enforcement, and I think this fits very much into what you guys do here, is that with drunk driving and with seatbelts, there were people who said, it'll never happen. You can't get someone to put a seatbelt on in the car. That's their domain. You can't get someone to not drink after the Super Bowl party and drive because that's how we behave. But over time, as there was strong laws that were enforced, you saw big changes in both those areas. That's what gives the safety advocates and some in the government reason to believe that change can happen here with a combination of tough laws and enforcement. Yes?
Perhaps you could comment, especially with regards to your upcoming article and sort of what I see as a linkage that has to do with this recent trial by Google to have a computer-driven car. And do you see that we will enhance safety through having computers do some of this detection for us while we're inside our vehicles?
You know, I'm going to be cautious because I don't know a ton about it other than to speak anecdotally, which is we recently got a Volvo that has this sensor in the back that warns you when you're going to run into something. And at first, it was just another noise, but as I've gotten accustomed to it, I've grown to rely on the notion that it's going to tell me there's something behind me. I have no research for you in this. I don't want to speak globally other than to say it seems conceivable that there's technology out there. Would I want a robot driving my car? It depends if we have the same choice of radio stations. Yes. Come to the mic. Sorry.
In one of the series of articles you did, you wrote about emergency workers and their constant connectivity. And in fact, most of the laws exempt bans on police and EMS. Has there been any steps taken since that article, or even before that, to specifically prohibit first responders, emergency personnel from distracted driving?
The short answer is I don't know. What I was told when I was doing that article was that for policymakers, restricting emergency responders is a bit of a third rail. And I think to some extent with good reason. It's very hard to find the lines there when lives are at stake and people are rushing to the hospital. I think my sense is that on local levels, I ran into a lot of organizations acting very responsibly in urging their first responders not to multitask behind the wheel. In some respects, when it's happening not on in an institutional way, but in a way that is as one paramedic told me of another paramedic driver he got furious with. I couldn't believe he was in the front checking baseball scores on his phone. Now, in cases where there have been accidents, and I can't remember, this was, I believe, in upstate New York, there was a horrific accident where one ambulance driver was looking at the GPS to find the next call, sheared off the side of the ambulance on a truck parked by the side of the road, and unfortunately paralyzed his partner in the passenger seat. And what they wound up doing is turning the screens away from the driver, and I think that's what some people are doing. As you might know from your question, sometimes a first responder is in the car by him or herself. An interesting technology has emerged for police. One of the things that police often need to do is punch into their gadgets the license plate of the driver in front of them. Well, you can see why there's real good reason to do that. If they believe a car is stolen, there's a fugitive. As a society, we can understand that interest. There's technology coming about that can read the license plate of the car and automatically tell the driver, this is one you ought to pay attention to, without having to go through the step of beep, 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 enter, communicate. So, yes.
I'm sitting here trying to think of technologies that might make protection of the occupants of the car or vehicle more passive. As you say, it took a long time to get people to fasten their seatbelts. But I remember, I think it was in 1978, I took a course here, and the professor, who was named Susan Baker, was telling us about this technology that had been invented called airbags that car manufacturers wouldn't put in place because it cost too much. So I'm sitting here trying to think, could there be a technology that, say, jammed the telephone signal or something like that?
So it's out there, and some places are starting to effectively shut off your phone while it's in the car. And in the case of, I believe, one insurance company, they will give you a premium break if you install this. At the same time, as this becomes an issue, fear sells, and it is also an opportunity for car makers. And from my passing observation of the car industry, because it's not really what I cover, I see them trying to find lots of places to get attention of consumers. You could imagine that one will say, look, here's built-in jamming technology for your 16-year-old new driver that conceivably would be a sales point. These problems are also capitalistic opportunities, so maybe. Yes? You get when you ask that question, you get a "we're looking forward" kind of answer. So, two different regimes, many different people, things change, circumstances change. They would say research has become clearer. So, one of those. Yeah, one or two more, I'm told. Yes.
Well, if I could just make a quick comment to your question about developing information. One of the things I think people need to understand is the role that your elected officials play in that kind of decision. Because I know this story quite well, and Congress prohibited me from releasing that information and testifying as a legislator. They still prohibit me.
Beautifully said. I see one more in the back. Why don't we make this the last one? Those are a lot of good points. I especially like the part where you talked about the role of journalists. Um, I actually was, I should have said earlier that education is a huge part of what all the public safety and government officials, enforcement and education. I erred in not mentioning that earlier, so thank you for bringing it up. I will address quickly this question about how we can work, journalists and the research community can work together. It's something we had dinner with Ms. Baker last night and talked a little bit about. There is a potentially very potent relationship between the science community and the journalistic community that oftentimes is not as potent as it might be because there's such wariness on the part of, in particular, scientists that they will be misquoted, taken out of context. I would urge you that most journalists are very careful. And if you start a relationship with us that says, look, I'm an open book here. I want to be, I understand that I may be reduced to a few sentences, but insofar as you can, try to stay true to what I'm doing, and then be willing to take the risk. Sometimes it's not going to work out. I read back everything I ever write about a scientist, the quotes and the facts to the scientists. I think more of my colleagues do that than you might imagine. So I just urge you to take the risks. You're doing remarkable stuff that is the seeds of great stories, and we need you to be able to take the risk to communicate that to us. Thank you.
Matt, I already sent you a text message thanking you, but if you would join me once again in thanking Matt Richtel for a very wonderful, important talk.